If you think old money was all pearls and manners, allow me to disabuse you of that quaint idea. My dears, pearls can crack and manners can be flung aside like yesterday's gloves when a fortune is large enough and a spirit unruly enough. In this little parade of scandals, you shall meet Consuelo Vanderbilt, the so-called dollar princess, sold off like a jeweled trinket to a duke she did not love. You shall laugh or gasp at Alice Roosevelt, who puffed her cigarettes atop the White House roof and tucked a live snake into her handbag as though it were no more unusual than rouge. And you shall see Pauline Chase, an actress who waltzed into London's high society, charming aristocrats who swore they despised the stage, even as they scrambled for a seat beside her. So, fasten your diamonds tightly and do keep your reputations close. These young women showed us that old money could be every bit as reckless, audacious, and deliciously scandalous as new. Now, let us begin.
Consuelo Vanderbilt entered the world in the last decades of the 19th century, a child born not only into wealth, but into a destiny that was carefully written for her. She was not raised as a girl with choices, but as an instrument in her mother's grand design. Alva Vanderbilt, determined to lift the family from the ranks of America's newly rich into the vaulted company of Europe's nobility, shaped Consuelo's life with an iron hand. In the Gilded Age, money could buy almost anything, but not quite the legitimacy that centuries of aristocratic blood conferred. That gap, narrow and cold, was where Consuelo's fate was sealed. From her earliest years, Consuelo was less a daughter than a project. Alva Vanderbilt regarded her child's every gesture as rehearsal for a role that must be played flawlessly upon the world stage. Tutors were summoned not to broaden Consuelo's imagination, but to sharpen her deportment. A slouch was met with correction, a misstep with reprimand. She was fitted with a steel brace to ensure her posture never faltered, the contraption biting into her shoulders as she recited lessons, a reminder that elegance would be carved into her whether she wished it or not. Alva's ambition was unyielding, her will a constant pressure upon the household. Meals, conversations, even the smallest social calls were treated as campaigns in a greater war for recognition. To Alva, the Vanderbilts' fortune was not enough. Respect, true, old-world respect, must be secured, and her daughter was the key. Consuelo grew up in rooms heavy with expectation, the atmosphere one of vigilance rather than warmth. She was taught not to dream, but to obey, to carry herself like a duchess long before any title was hers. Her beauty was described as ethereal, her manners flawless, her fortune immense. She might have imagined a future where such gifts allowed her to choose freely, but her mother had other plans. The Duke of Marlborough, with one of the most historic names in Britain, was a man in need of cash to support his estate, Blenheim Palace, which loomed like a symbol of grandeur and ruin combined. The match was perfect on paper, a British title saved from decay by an American fortune, a Vanderbilt fortune, and so the bargain was struck. Consuelo's objections were crushed with maternal force. Alva locked her in her room, commanded her tears to silence, and pressed her forward as though she were no more than a piece of jewellery to be fitted onto a crown. The wedding was staged like a coronation, an event meant not for two young people, but for two continents watching. St. Thomas Church in New York overflowed with 1,000 eyes, each pair fixed on the spectacle of fortune and title being welded together. The nave shimmered with gold and white, flowers spilling from every surface, the air thick with perfume and whispered speculation. Society's grandees craned their necks to glimpse the gown, a confection of ivory satin sewn with pearls that caught the candlelight in trembling sparks. But beneath the silk and lace, beneath the towering veil, was a girl of 20 with eyes swollen from weeping. Her face, concealed by fabric, bore the evidence of sleepless nights and protests silenced. To the crowd, she was radiant. To herself, she was a prisoner stepping into a gilded cage. As the organ thundered and the vows were spoken, no one in the pews saw the tremor in her hands or the heaviness in her chest. They saw only triumph, the Vanderbilt fortune securing a dukedom, a palace saved, and an American dynasty elevated at last. The theatre was flawless, the tragedy invisible. The marriage was not a marriage in the tender sense of the word. The Duke, cold and ambitious, regarded his bride as the means by which Blenheim would survive. And survive it did, brick by brick, roof by roof, on the streams of Vanderbilt money that flowed into its crumbling veins. Blenheim Palace, colossal and magnificent, was more mausoleum than home. Its endless corridors echoed with draughts that no fire could warm, its grand halls filled with portraits of ancestors staring down at the unwilling new Duchess who had paid for their preservation. Consuelo's fortune mended the leaking ceilings, reopened shuttered rooms, and paid the wages of the staff, who once again bustled through its wings. Visitors admired the revival, unaware that it was bought at the price of her spirit. She walked through those chambers like a guest in her own life, surrounded by opulence that belonged to the house, not to her. The palace demanded her wealth, consumed her presence, and gave back only loneliness. To the outside world, it was a triumph of heritage, saved by American riches. To Consuelo, it was a splendid prison, its beauty as suffocating as its silence. But unlike many who bent under such circumstances, Consuelo carried within her a private rebellion. The woman who had once been paraded like an ornament began, cautiously at first, to step into her own strength. Consuelo turned from the chandeliers of Blenheim's drawing rooms toward the crowded halls where suffragists gathered, voices sharpened with conviction. She corresponded with reformers, lent her name to petitions, and, in time, stood before audiences herself. There was a quiet electricity in those moments. The Duchess of Marlborough, born into riches and forced into a crown she did not want, now speaking of liberty for women who had none. Newspapers reported on her presence with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, for it was not expected that a woman of her standing would involve herself in the struggles of the street. Yet Consuelo understood the bitter irony more than most. She had lived it. She who had been denied her own choice of husband now insisted that women must at least be allowed the choice of their leaders. Her speeches carried not only the resonance of wealth, but the sting of lived truth. To polite society, it was unbecoming. To many women, it was galvanizing. In lending her voice, Consuelo transformed her suffering into testimony. What she had endured in silence, she now offered as fuel for change. As she grew older, her sense of duty to society gave way to the urgency of her own soul. She found her voice not in the gilded ballrooms, but in the cause of women's suffrage, speaking for freedom when she herself had been denied it. The irony was not lost. The Duchess, who could not choose her own husband, now argued that women everywhere must have the right to choose their leaders. Eventually, the brittle facade of the marriage splintered beyond repair. Years of cold silences and dutiful appearances had done their damage, and the union that was meant to bind a fortune to a title dissolved in bitterness. Divorce, in that era, was not whispered politely. It was shouted across newspapers, dissected in gossip columns, and passed between aristocratic drawing rooms like scandalous contraband. The Duchess of Marlborough, seeking her freedom, was a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic. For the Vanderbilt family, the whispers carried a note of humiliation. The entire enterprise had been conceived as triumph, as proof that new American money could graft itself onto ancient European branches. Now, with the marriage unraveling in courtrooms, it was paraded as failure. Reporters followed every development, caricaturing the cold Duke, speculating on Consuelo's misery, hinting at infidelities, and questioning the very arrangement that had once been hailed as a masterstroke of social ambition. The fall was as public as the wedding had been dazzling, and yet for Consuelo, scandal was liberation. The chains forged by Alva's will and the Duke's indifference fell away. For the first time in her life, she was not a pawn in someone else's game, but a woman with the chance to choose her own future. What she chose was love. Jacques Balsan entered her life not as a titled figure or a man in need of her wealth, but as a companion of spirit. A French aviator and industrialist, he brought with him no palaces to repair, no dynastic expectations to shoulder, only laughter, warmth, and a freedom Consuelo had never known. With Jacques, she was not a duchess, not an heiress, not an emblem of transactional union. but simply a woman, cherished for herself. The contrast could not have been sharper. At Blenheim, she had walked through cavernous halls, as though through a tomb. With Jacques, she walked under open skies, travelling across Europe, visiting friends, hosting salons where wit and conversation replaced duty and silence. Where once she had endured the heavy grandeur of endless banquets, now she delighted in meals taken in gardens, in the company of equals. Where once her fortune had been consumed to preserve a palace, now her heart was nourished in the intimacy of genuine companionship. Observers noted the change in her demeanour. The woman who had once moved like a ghost through Blenheim's galleries now laughed freely, her face animated not by expectation, but by joy. Her marriage to Jacques lasted until his death decades later, a quiet and enduring partnership that stood in luminous contrast to the cold bargain of her youth. The scandal of divorce had transformed her in the eyes of society. To some, she was still the Duchess who had broken her vows. To others, she was proof that courage could carve a path through even the densest web of tradition. And in her own eyes, she was finally what she had long been denied the chance to be, a woman who had chosen. Her later life was spent not in the rigid choreography of aristocratic expectation, but in philanthropy and public service. She endowed schools, gave to hospitals, and lent her energy to causes that touched lives far outside her own circle. The girl who had been locked in a room by her mother grew into a woman who opened doors for others. Yet the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt does not end neatly with liberation or romance. It lingers, unsettled, a reminder of how wealth can both gild and corrode a life. She herself understood this duality, and late in life she chose to confront it. In her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, she peeled back the polished veneer and allowed the world a glimpse into the cage she had inhabited. With candour rare among her class, she described the iron grip of her mother's ambition, the tears behind her bridal veil, and the hollow grandeur of Blenheim. "I spent my childhood in a sort of golden prison," she admitted, the words carrying the weary truth of someone who had lived as both ornament and sacrifice. Readers expecting flattery of dukes and duchesses instead found disquiet. The portrait of a system in which human lives, particularly the lives of young women, were currency to be spent. But the memoir was not simply a confession of sorrow. It was also a testament to transformation. She wrote of her second marriage with affection, of the laughter and ease she had finally discovered, of the deep satisfaction found in work that mattered, philanthropy, education, suffrage. It was as if she were determined that the last word on her life should not be the tears of a coerced bride, but the clear-eyed reflections of a woman who had endured, resisted, and ultimately chosen her own path. Her name, therefore, endures as both caution and inspiration. She revealed that beneath the glitter of nobility lay bargains struck in coercion, alliances forged in cold calculation. Yet she also proved that rebellion, even delayed, even hard-won, remains possible. The Duchess, who had been forced into silence, left behind not just palaces, restored by her fortune, but words that carried the weight of her truth. And through those words, her story lingers, a tale of beauty wrapped in sorrow, of splendour shadowed by sacrifice, and of the enduring human will to break chains, however finely wrought they may be.
The Life and Times of Pauline Chase. It was once said by a grand dowager in Mayfair that actresses should be admired only from the distance of an opera glass, never seated beside one at dinner. But the dowager, for all her hauteur, neglected to mention that half the men at her own table had already dispensed with the opera glass and paid personal visits backstage. Society was very good at condemning actresses in public while sending flowers and love notes in private. The hypocrisy was so polished, it almost shone brighter than the silver. To be clear, the aristocracy treated the theatre as though it were a dangerous but necessary vice, much like gambling or oysters. It was acceptable to applaud from the royal box, but not to admit that one had shaken hands, or anything else, with the performers. The actress was to be applauded, adored, but never introduced. She was a creature of the spotlight, not of the drawing room. Pauline Chase, however, seemed determined to reverse this arrangement. Where others bowed to the invisible barrier between stage and salon, she waltzed straight through it, smiling at the scandal she left in her wake. If society wanted actresses to remain at a safe distance, Pauline's instinct was to lean closer, lift her glass, and ask which duke would be kind enough to pour the wine. Pauline was born in the year 1885, to no great fortune, and certainly to no expectation that she would one day glitter across 2 continents. She began as a chorus girl, one of the countless young women who filled the back rows of productions, smiling brightly while praying the rent might be covered for another week. The life of a chorus girl was precarious. Balanced on aching feet and fragile respectability. They were admired, yes, but also dismissed as replaceable ornaments, disposable as soon as youth faded, or a prettier face appeared at the audition door. For most, the stage was a revolving door of fleeting opportunities, endless rehearsals, and the constant shadow of scandal if one was seen in the wrong company. Pauline, however, refused to be a shadow. Even in the back row, she carried herself with the unspoken conviction that she belonged in the center. Audiences noticed, producers noticed, more importantly, London noticed. Her chance came with Peter Pan, where she was given not merely a part, but a role that demanded daring. In playing the boy who never grew up, Pauline presented herself as more than an actress. She became a symbol of irreverence, youth, and defiance. The performance was magnetic, and for once, society could not look away. What transformed her from background decoration to international scandal was not only talent, but persistence. Chorus girls were meant to hover at the edges of society, yet Pauline used the theatre as her ladder. Every performance was another rung climbed, every ovation another proof that she was no mere ornament. By her early 20s, she was not just playing Peter Pan on stage, she was living the role in reality, flying above the limits set for her, and tugging half of London's aristocracy along for the ride. There, she embodied Peter Pan, forever youthful, forever daring, a figure who never quite grew up but insisted on drawing others into her mischievous orbit. The theatre was supposed to be her ceiling. For women of her background, the stage was a glass wall, transparent, enticing, but unbreachable. Yet Pauline vaulted through it with all the determination of a climber scaling the Alps. By her early 20s, she was not merely performing for society, she was dining with it. Aristocrats who once swore never to consort with actresses suddenly found themselves charmed by her quick wit, her striking beauty, and her ability to glide through a ballroom as though she owned every chandelier. Whispers began almost as soon as Pauline's star ascended, and in Edwardian society, a whisper was never just a whisper. It was a declaration, a judgment, and an entertainment rolled into one. Within weeks of her triumph in Peter Pan, her name was being murmured in drawing rooms with the same urgency usually reserved for wars or stock market panics. The subject, of course, was not her acting. It was her companions. There were dukes who suddenly found a taste for theatre, despite previously proclaiming the stage a corrupting influence. There were barons who claimed to be allergic to limelight, yet somehow managed to be photographed in Pauline's company, hats pulled low and moustaches quivering with nervous pride. And then there were the rumours, Those delicious, dangerous hints that perhaps even a royal or two had been caught in Pauline's orbit. Naturally, the newspapers could never print names outright. Instead, they perfected the art of the suggestive ellipsis. A certain young actress, much admired by a gentleman of high distinction, the ellipsis did all the work, leaving the public to imagine crowns and coronets tumbling onto Pauline's dressing table. What made the whispers so intoxicating was the way they challenged the established order. Aristocrats were meant to marry heiresses, women weighed down by tiaras and ancestral expectations, not actresses with quick tongues and quicker reputations. But Pauline seemed to reveal that the heart was not so easily bound by genealogy. Men who had inherited centuries of power found themselves undone by an American girl who knew how to laugh at their stiff manners and who could turn a dinner table into her own private stage. Society, of course, pretended to be appalled. Ladies fluttered their fans and exclaimed that such behavior was shocking. And yet, when the very same ladies retired upstairs, they read the gossip columns with the eagerness of schoolchildren devouring sweets. One could almost hear the hypocrisy groaning under its own weight. It was said that more than one dowager scolded her grandson for attending Pauline's performances in public, only to inquire afterwards, sotto voce, what precisely she had worn on stage. Pauline herself never confirmed nor denied the stories. That was her greatest act of all, an actress who knew that mystery was far more powerful than confession. To deny would have been to end the speculation. To confirm would have been vulgar. By refusing both, she turned herself into a riddle that society could never solve. And like all great riddles, she became irresistible. At the heart of it all was the unspoken tension. If an actress could command dukes, and if an American outsider could occupy the fantasies of Europe's aristocracy, then what did that say about the stability of class itself? The old order was meant to be unshakable, but Pauline was living proof that desire could topple walls thicker than stone. Each new rumour was not just scandal, it was dynamite placed beneath the foundations of social order. Even decades later, long after she had left the stage, people still remembered the rumours more vividly than her performances. It was the possibility that kept her name alive, the possibility that a duke had risked his title, that a prince had risked his discretion, that the glittering fortress of aristocracy had been breached by a girl who once danced in the chorus line. And that possibility was the very essence of Pauline Chase. The intoxicating blend of laughter, scandal, and audacity that made her unforgettable. The aristocracy, after all, thrived on its own illusion of permanence. Titles, estates, centuries of ancestry, they were the bricks in a fortress meant to keep outsiders firmly in their place. The great families of Britain believed themselves to be unassailable, a caste apart, elevated above the fickle winds of fashion. Their rules were designed like iron gates, heavy, ornate, and meant to stay shut. And yet, here was Pauline Chase, the unlikeliest of intruders. An American, an actress, a woman from the chorus line, everything that polite society insisted was beneath them. She did not creep in apologetically, head bowed, as though grateful for charity. She entered as though the ballroom belonged to her, as though chandeliers had been hung for her benefit alone. When she laughed, men forgot their duty. When she danced, titles and fortunes seemed to evaporate. She treated dukes as though they were characters in one of her plays, and the effect was as scandalous as it was irresistible. For those bred in privilege, the very sight of her was unnerving. If an outsider like Pauline could be not only admitted, but adored, what did that say about the supposedly sacred hierarchy? What good were ancient coats of arms if they could be undone by a smile and a daring American accent? The fortress began to look less like stone and more like papier-mâché, impressive at a distance, but fragile to the touch. This tension, the battle between birthright and audacity, was precisely what made her story so dangerous. Pauline revealed a secret the aristocracy tried desperately to conceal, that their world depended on performance just as much as hers. They acted out roles of dignity, lineage, superiority. She, an actress by trade, simply played her part better. In her presence, the line between titled grandeur and theatrical illusion grew thin, almost transparent. To the public, she was thrilling, a living challenge to the pretensions of class. To the old guard, she was something far worse, proof that their world could be breached, not by wealth, but by charm and daring. Pauline's story, when seen in the long arc of history, is not merely one of personal scandal. It is a parable of the Gilded Age itself, where money, class, and entertainment collided in increasingly spectacular fashion. The heiresses of that period were often judged for their fortunes, their marriages, their jewels. But Pauline was judged for something far subtler and far more dangerous: her ability to expose the tension between the old and the new, between what society said it valued and what it secretly desired. By the time she retired from the stage, Pauline had transformed herself into more than an actress. She was a figure who haunted the imagination of the elite. They could dismiss her, but they could not forget her. She represented a future in which the boundaries of class, though still rigid, could be crossed by those willing to pay the price of scandal. In the end, Pauline Chase's legacy lies not in the roles she played on stage, but in the role she played off it. A woman who turned whispers into headlines, who made rebellion appear elegant, and who forced 2 continents to admit that desire often speaks louder than pedigree. She remains a reminder that sometimes the most subversive act is not to break the rules, but to walk into the ballroom, smile at the dowager, and take the Duke's fork.
They said she could do anything but sit still and behave. Alice Roosevelt, eldest daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, was born in the gilded halls of privilege, and almost immediately made it her business to upset every chandelier she walked beneath. If society expected her to smile sweetly, sip her tea, and embroider cushions, Alice preferred to sip whiskey, wager on horses, and slip a live snake into her handbag before stepping into the company of senators and dukes. Her humour was razor sharp, the kind that could flay a reputation with a single line, and she knew it. "If you can't say something good about someone," she once declared, "sit right here by me." Washington society was both terrified and spellbound. She had a genius for turning moments of high ceremony into spectacles of mischief. Once, during a formal reception, Alice amused herself by placing bets on horse races, while senators, supposed guardians of the nation's dignity, shifted uneasily nearby, torn between scandal and envy. On another occasion, she shocked White House staff by taking a knife to the carpet in the East Room, cutting out a piece as a personal keepsake, as though the presidential mansion itself were nothing more than her private playhouse. These were not accidents, nor lapses of youthful decorum. They were deliberate provocations, playful acts of rebellion meant to remind the establishment that even the most sacred rituals of American power could be mocked, and mocked well. From her earliest years, Alice seemed to relish the role of mischief maker in a city built on marble dignity. At a time when young women of her rank were meant to represent their family's honor in spotless white gloves, she climbed onto the White House roof to smoke cigarettes, her silhouette outlined against the Washington skyline like a scandal in the making. Reporters lapped it up. She knew they would. She cultivated a performance, a dance with notoriety, always one step ahead of the gasping moralists who found her irresistible. To smoke in public was already daring for a woman of her station. Ladies were expected to faint delicately, not puff defiantly, but to do so on the roof of the White House was a gesture of pure theatre. It was as if Alice had climbed up to declare, "Behold, America, your president's daughter has chosen nicotine over needlework." The papers ate it alive. One columnist quipped that if Congress truly wished to regulate vice, they might start with the president's own offspring. To suffragists, her antics were confusing. Was she a rebellious ally, or a distraction wrapped in cigarette smoke? To traditionalists, she was little less than a national disgrace, a Marlborough manifesto scrawled across the Washington skyline. And to Alice, the entire uproar was delicious. She was not just smoking, she was writing her own headlines in curls of smoke that drifted down over the Capitol. Her nickname, Princess Alice, was meant half in jest, half in reprimand. But the press gave her that crown gladly, and she wore it with sly delight. She understood something crucial about power in the Gilded Age. Money and lineage built the stage, but scandal lit the lamps. So she drove her cars fast, and made sure to do so in full view of the gossip columns. She bet on races as men did, throwing down wagers with a confidence that made even seasoned gamblers blink. She stretched propriety like a piece of silk pulled taut, threatening to tear, but never quite snapping, until it did. Alice's pet snake, Emily Spinach, was her most infamous accessory. She would bring it coiled in her purse to teas, dinners, and receptions. The creature was more than a prop. It was a signal. This was a young woman who would not be tamed by etiquette, nor confined to her role as presidential daughter. She once quipped that Emily was as green as spinach and as thin as my Aunt Emily. That same biting wit, rolled casually off her tongue, became her signature. One did not invite Alice for polite company. One invited her for danger, for unpredictability, for the thrill of sitting too close to the flame. When Alice stepped onto the transatlantic stage, the British aristocracy leaned in with morbid curiosity. Here was America's uncrowned princess, not swathed in dutiful modesty, but striding into drawing rooms with cigarette smoke curling behind her and laughter as sharp as shattered glass. The British tabloids, always eager to sneer at American excess while simultaneously feasting on it, could not look away, and Alice, with her singular instinct for publicity, ensured they never could. Her affairs, if we may call them that, were never simply about love or even lust. They were acts of insurgency. Rumours swirled like champagne bubbles at every dinner party, whispers of trysts with congressmen, foreign envoys, and even a czarist officer or two. Washington insiders swore that she flirted with Nicholas Longworth, an Ohio congressman later to become Speaker of the House, with a charm so reckless it seemed almost like sabotage. When she eventually married him, society wagged its tongue and declared it the most unsurprising surprise in recent memory. Others insisted that her real passions drifted elsewhere, that she was incapable of fidelity, because fidelity was simply too boring a pastime for a Roosevelt. The press, naturally, sharpened their pencils with delight. They hinted, they speculated, they embroidered. A mere conversation across a ballroom floor was elevated into a torrid liaison. A carriage ride at dusk became an assignation fit for French novels. Editors knew well that their readers wanted their princess not draped in lace, but wrapped in scandal. Alice obliged by being seen everywhere with everyone, knowing the ambiguity was half the fun. She was less a woman in love than a director orchestrating her own melodrama, and society willingly purchased tickets. For old money families, these whispers were lethal currency. A daughter's reputation was a bond certificate, securing her family's alliances. Alice shredded hers with a smile. When critics tried to shame her, she responded with wit sharp enough to leave them bleeding. "I can be prim," she once remarked, "but I doubt anyone would believe it. One senator confessed that conversing with her felt like playing chess with a cat. The pieces would vanish, the rules would change, and somehow she always won. What unsettled her contemporaries was not the prospect of Alice actually losing herself in romance. It was that she treated men, and the institutions they represented, as props. Each whispered affair undermined the solemn rituals of courtship and alliance upon which society depended. Aristocratic families across the Atlantic winced at her reputation, but devoured every detail of it in the papers. She had achieved something extraordinary, transforming scandal itself into a form of aristocratic capital. Her affairs, then, were less the stuff of bedrooms than of headlines. And Alice, ever the strategist, understood that rumours, once unleashed, never really die. They coil themselves into memory, like her beloved Emily Spinach in its purse, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This rebellion was not mere caprice. It was theatre, and in theatre, Alice Roosevelt excelled. She played her audience like a violin, knowing exactly how much to reveal, how much to hint at, how much to let them invent on their own. The paradox was irresistible. She was both the president's daughter and society's scandal, a creature of impeccable lineage and reckless appetite. Her contradictions fed the newspapers for decades, and she in turn fed on the attention. Age did not dim Alice Roosevelt. It sharpened her. If in youth she had been the scandalous ingenue, in maturity she became the oracle of Washington's drawing rooms, a power broker armed not with votes or money, but with her tongue. Politicians sought her approval, or at least braced themselves for her ridicule, for an Alice quip could reduce a career to ashes before dessert. She lived long enough to attend the administrations of men who had once been children, when she was already notorious. They, in turn, bowed to her as a living relic, half in reverence, half in terror. She transformed her salons into unofficial courts of influence. Presidents, senators, foreign dignitaries, all found themselves perched on her sofas, desperate for her acceptance, wary of her wit. She spoke in barbed epigrams, phrases that struck like blades dipped in honey. When asked why she attended every political function, she smiled and replied, "Because if I stayed at home, I should know who was here, having fun without me." Washington laughed, and Washington understood that she was not merely joking. She was staking her claim as the capital's eternal observer, judge, and executioner. What fascinated those who knew her was the seamlessness of her transformation. The young rebel who smoked on the White House roof had become the grande dame who presided over the capital's gossip and intrigue. Yet the essence was unchanged. Her rebellion had simply matured into authority. She no longer shocked with cigarettes and fast cars. She shocked with memory, with longevity, with the unnerving knowledge that she had seen everyone's rise and would live to see their fall. To cross Alice was to invite humiliation. To court her was to seek legitimacy. She outlived most of her rivals and many of her friends, surviving until the year 1980. By then, she was less a person than an institution. In the end, Alice Roosevelt was both the spark and the flame, the scandal that ignited gossip and the fire that smouldered long after the Gilded Age was gone. She proved that rebellion could be refined, that audacity could wear pearls, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the general, the banker, or the president, but a woman with wit, wealth, and no intention of behaving. Alice was not merely a daughter of a president. She was a daughter of America's appetite for spectacle. And when she was finished, she left history with a grin, a cloud of smoke, and the unsettling certainty that the house of old money could always, always be set aflame from within.
And so, you see what pearls cannot hide and what fortunes cannot polish away. Behind every glittering ballroom and every noble title lies a trail of whispers, rebellions, and little scandals that made the world lean in closer. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alice Roosevelt, Pauline Chase, each in her own way. They tore the lace from society's corset and dared to breathe freely. Old money would like you to believe it is timeless, untouchable, immune to the tempest of passion and folly, but these women proved otherwise. They were not ornaments on family crests. They were sparks that set drawing rooms alight, reminders that wealth cannot cage desire forever. If you've enjoyed stepping into their world with me, do remember there are countless more tales where these came from. Subscribe, and together we shall continue to peer behind the velvet curtains of privilege, where luxury and scandal walk arm in arm. Until next time, my darlings, keep your pearls polished and your secrets even closer.